My name is Chris Saliga, and I'm dressed kind of differently. You can start, Tim. I'm dressed kind of differently because I'm a Catholic priest, and I'm a member of a religious order popularly known as the Dominicans. We've been around for about 800 years. So we haven't modified our sense of style very much. So I'm in a white coat of a different kind. I'm also a registered nurse. And so I'm bringing perspectives today that are deeply philosophical and even theological. And when I say theological, I mean in the sense of faith seeking a kind of understanding coming out of a Catholic background. The Integritas Institute here at the UIC is a Catholic organization designed to bring some Catholic wisdom to the table in pondering a variety of ethical issues. So we're going to do that today. You got it? Okay, so before I begin, I know we've got people here with backgrounds in nursing, dentistry, public health. Some of you are medical students, some are pre-med. Any other disciplines represented here today that I'm missing? Disability studies.
Business analytics.
Business ethics.
Analytics. Industry for personal.
Uh-huh. Social work, wonderful. Any other disciplines?
Finance. I work in finance.
Finance. Well, that certainly weighs into these end-of-life concerns.
I find this very interesting.
Yes. So as we kind of get ourselves gathered here, what I'd like to do, some of you may be people of prayer, others may not. So as a kind of prayer, I'd just like to open with a poem by a poet I've never heard of, named H.F. Light. Has anyone ever heard of H.F. Light? Any liberal artists here? Anyway, this poem, as you listen to it, it's really a prayer. Abide with me, fast falls the eventide. The darkness deepens. Lord, with me abide. When other helpers fail and comforts flee, help the helpless, oh abide with me. Swift to its close ebbs out life's little day. Earth's joys grow dim, its glories pass away. Change and decay in all around I see. O thou who changest not, abide with me. Hold thou thy cross before my closing eyes. Shine through the gloom and point me to the skies. Heaven's morning breaks and earth's vain shadows flee. In life, in death, O Lord, abide with me. You might wonder what a Catholic priest who happens to be a nurse is doing reflecting on assisted suicide. I currently serve as interim director for the Integritas Institute. And the board chose as our overarching theme for this year, effects of politics on healthcare. And assisted suicide, questions regarding euthanasia, have been on the table in the political process, in legislatures, for longer than some of you may realize, here in the United States and elsewhere. So given that theme of the year, it's very relevant. And opening with another quotation from someone who, as far as I know, doesn't share my Catholic faith. Have any of you ever heard of Paul Kalanithi? He wrote a book as he was dying called When Breath Becomes Air. I flipped through the CT scan images, the diagnosis obvious. The lungs were matted with innumerable tumors, the spine deformed, a full lobe of the liver obliterated, cancer widely disseminated. I was a neurosurgical resident entering my final year of training. Over the last 6 years, I'd examined scores of such scans on the off chance that some procedure might benefit the patient. But this scan was different. It was my own. I wasn't in the radiology suite, wearing my scrubs and white coat. I was dressed in a patient's gown, tethered to an IV pole, using the computer the nurse had left in my hospital room with my wife, Lucy, an internist, at my side. I went through each sequence again, the lung window, the bone window, the liver window, scrolling from top to bottom, then left to right, then front to back, just as I had been trained to do, as if I might find something that would change the diagnosis. We lay together on the hospital bed, Lucy quietly, as if reading from a script. Do you think there's any possibility that it's something else? No, I said. Kalanithi would pass, and this is the book he wrote as he was going through that process. It's an excellent read. We're all going to die. All of us. That's one of the few guarantees we have in life. The question is, it's kind of simple. Do I have the right to take my life given undue suffering? Doesn't it seem quite apparent that suffering does not have religious value in all cases? It doesn't always have religious value, especially when people don't have recourse. A few key terms and a couple of cases will help us ponder these and similar questions philosophically and theologically. And just a word from my nursing perspective, nurses in the room already know this. We nurses think differently than physicians and some other clinicians. We primarily concern ourselves with patient responses. Yes to illness, yes to trauma, any combination thereof. Also responses to treatments, care modalities, you name it. And although I've been a priest, although I've been a Dominican friar now for almost 20 years, I still think a lot as a nurse. My mind works that way. So autonomy, freedom, and assisted suicide. Human flourishing within end-of-life contexts. I think it's safe to say that assisted suicide can be a form of euthanasia. Euthanasia is understood by my church, the Catholic Church, to be, quote, an action or an omission which of itself or by intention causes death in order that all suffering may be in this way eliminated. I'm going to intervene. Maybe I'm going to withhold something. Maybe I'm going to give something. Maybe I'm going to do something that is ordered to kill you so as to end your suffering. Assisted suicide can be understood as a form of that. So can unassisted suicide in certain respects. A clinician prescribes a lethal dose or combination of medicine by which I can kill myself with or without additional assistance of friends and or family in order to end my suffering. We simply can call this self-administered euthanasia, given what's at play. And we can call it assisted suicide, clinician-assisted suicide, physician-assisted suicide. Some are referring to this now simply generically as aid in dying, or medical aid in dying. There are many ways in which this is phrased, but it's certainly out there. In Oregon, where it's been legal for 19 years, since 1998, what we've seen in the data is that ranked number one, or very close to it, every single year, when patients who seek assisted suicide are asked why, the vast majority answer that their number one concern is a fear of losing their autonomy. And ranked closely with that are things correlative with one's ability to exercise autonomy, to exercise choice-making capacity, such as being less able to do joyful activities, less control over bodily functions, becoming a burden on significant others, moving through this trajectory that is horrifying from agency to patience, to becoming a real patient, to actually needing others to do things for me or help me. This is horrifying for folks. And in both Washington and Oregon, Washington, it's been legal since about 2009. These come up at the top every year. So what is autonomy? We all know basically. Autonomy is it's the ability to make choices without paternalistic interference or coercion. And it's got a very important place in the history of bioethics in the United States, especially when we think in terms of the history in this country and elsewhere of abuse of human research subjects. Think of Henry Beecher's groundbreaking article back in the 60s about abuses he'd seen. Think of the Tuskegee syphilis experiments right here in the U.S., the racism and all that goes with that. We don't even have to go to what happened in the German academic medicine and how that got exploited. That was already there, but it got exploited, it got tapped into by the Third Reich. We know that some of this stuff has been on the table in academic medicine since easily the tail end of the 19th century. So, autonomy and respect for it is very important, right? Because it's there as basically one of the main theoretical bases for informed consent norms, right? Within given specifications, right? Within my hospital, within my healthcare system, whatever the case may be. It's there to protect me. It's there to protect you. But is that all there is to the picture? And is that really, in and of itself, a sufficient basis for informed consent? Especially with decisions where it's legal. Where it's legal, right? You can find yourself in practice in the future in a place like Washington or Oregon, California, where it's cropping up, Colorado. It's almost been legalized. It's come close in a lot of states. You might be surprised. Well, in his book entitled Who Should Decide Paternalism in Healthcare, James Childress, this was a book that came out in 1982. Now, I use a book going back this far and a case going back this far so that for some of you who are fairly young, you might see that this is not as new as it may seem to be. He presents a case of a patient named Joe Roman to illustrate that, in his estimation, suicide, assisted or unassisted, may flow out of an autonomous choice that ought to be respected by healthcare professionals. I don't agree with that, but we're going to see that given a major premise, this is a very valid thing to hold. The case as he presents it goes like this. On June 9th, 1979, artist Joe Roman, 62 years old, began fashioning her life sculpture, a pine coffin-like box filled with personal mementos, with the help of her family and her close friends. Early the next morning, having finished her project, written a farewell letter to 60 friends, and said goodbye to her family, she swallowed 35 sleeping pills washed down with champagne. This is in 1979. Mrs. Roman had planned her death for 15 months. It was her view that life can be transformed into art and that a person should take command of making life's final brushstroke. Her original plan had been to end her life at age 75. But when she learned in March of 1978 that she had breast cancer which had spread to her lymph nodes, she decided to, quote, make the best possible calculation of a time frame within which she might count reasonably on being able to function to her satisfaction. It is significant to note that Roman's autopsy later indicated that her cancer had not spread and her death was not imminent. So this was not an end-of-life case of someone sort of doubled up in pain as they're actively dying or something like that. She said in her farewell letter that she had concluded that suicide need not be pathological, that rational suicide makes possible a truly ideal closing of one's lifespan. Joe Roman was described by her friends as anything but morbid and as a talented artist with a large lust for life. Her suicide note, which she had notarized 2 days before her death, detailed her plans and stated that she wanted to spare herself, her family, and friends of the ravages of cancer. She certainly feared something. It was also intended to absolve those close to her of any complicity in her suicide. She had undergone 10 months of chemotherapy before deciding to end the treatment. She later wrote, My medical team believed they had more of a right than I to command my life. This was definitely an action taken by her in reaction to what she perceived and understood to be kind of, you might call it paternalistic or coercive interference by her medical team. I don't know all the facts, but that is how she understood it. Now, when freedom is equated with autonomy, denying Roman her wish to commit suicide is seen as a violation of her freedom to end her life on her own terms. Because Roman had sufficient decisional capacity, it is clear that she autonomously chose to kill herself with the collaborative support of her loved ones. Respectful of personal autonomy, well-intentioned people, including clinicians, are often careful to avoid undue influence over patients like Roman who are considering such options. Kind of a major premise here would be that killing oneself is seen to be objectively neutral, leaving me, the patient, to decide between life and death in this way. Since Roman autonomously asserted suicide to be a personal benefit rather than a setback, her supporters caused her no harm. And you can see this major premise at play, not just in Childress's work, but in Beauchamp and Childress's work with the principles of healthcare ethics. The balancing of the prima facie principles of respect for autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice, as understood within a given specification of overarching, you might say, meta-norms, within a set of hospital policies, nurse practice acts, state and federal law. But is it really this simple? Does freedom only encompass the absence of coercion, of freedom from paternalistic strictures? Or might freedom be bigger than this? Might it be, in some respects, more deeply ingrained that in each subject, even when facing tremendous suffering, there's real progress still possible? Now we go theological. And what I'm about to share with you is just a glance, because I want to leave time for us to open this up so you guys can raise questions. It's just a looking glass view into something called freedom for excellence. I like to call it freedom to flourish. But it's definitely a freedom for that includes freedom from. We'll see that. It includes autonomy, but autonomy rooted in something deeper. And it involves real human progress. The theologian I borrow from on this is somebody with a name you've probably not heard, and it's a strange name to American ears. His name was Servais Pinckaers, and he taught foundational theology at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland for many years. So he's a foundational moral theologian. He's a Catholic thinker, okay? And he didn't do bioethics at all. But we're getting down to a kind of a foundational basis here. So he demonstrates that there's something more to freedom than mere choice-making capacity by analogically reflected upon human freedom via music and language acquisition. He uses these analogs to help us think about this. Basically, a person gifted with the proper aptitude can freely learn to play the piano via practice in accord with music theory, and usually some level of expert instruction. In so doing, one progresses from potential to actual pianist. Although the actual pianist's basic choice-making capacity will not have changed, the actual pianist now enjoys a significantly expanded range of free action, given natural aptitudes, natural inclinations, you might say, precised into virtue. In this respect, we would talk about art as a virtue of the practical intellect by which the artist is able to inform or bring to form some level of matter. Music is helpful because it deals with sound. And we know that musicians bring order to that in various genres. Now, rather than mere choice-making capacity, human freedom involves progress focused primarily upon what I am free for and secondarily upon what I am free from. There's a both and. So this is not a dissing of autonomy, but it's seeing autonomy vis-a-vis this broader recognition of what freedom looks like in practice when our freedom is enhanced. We can think of a dark analog with something like crystal methamphetamine, right? Or highly addictive. We know we've got an opiate crisis in this country too. We've got crystal meth in a lot of the rural areas, and we've got opiates kind of all the way around. But we know that there are decisions we can take by which our freedom is also reduced. We can, in effect, by exercising choice-making capacity between a variety of options on the table, without even having to think morally about it, simply recognize that there are decisions I can take that would lessen or perhaps definitively end my ability as a choice-making agent to make choices in a broader rather than narrower framework. So if I have a crystal meth addiction, I lose a certain amount of freedom for flourishing, right? And this can destroy me unless I get help and hopefully find my way out. That's very dark, but I think everyone here would agree that we can grow in freedom and we can also degrade in freedom by exercising, more or less reasonably, our choice-making capacity. So I turn now to a case of a young woman who lived a life of more or less profound faith. I know her case a lot better than I know Joe Roman's case. I picked Joe Roman's case because it gave us such a clear look at autonomy exercised within a given understanding. Now we're going to see a woman who allows a relationship and a variety of relationships to ground her freedom more completely. This relationship can be called, Buber calls it the I-thou relationship. This will become clear as we progress. Bear with me for just about 10 to 15 more minutes and then we're going to open it up. And I can go into more depth with these things depending on the questions. But I just want to give you guys kind of what does this look like. So at 12 years old, Krista Karnowski decided that she would live her life in accord with God's will, as she understood that. She began by reading Scripture daily, with a special emphasis on the wisdom literature, her favorite book within the Bible being Proverbs. Before long, she began to apply the lessons therein to her daily life. For example, she saw all other people as her brothers and sisters in the Lord, especially those less fortunate than herself. Like the piano student who must act in response to the notation on the musical pages in order to share the gift of beautiful sound with others, Karnowski responded lovingly to the words on the sacred pages of Scripture by actively participating in her church's outreach program, especially to the economically disadvantaged. Much more than an avid reader and a church volunteer, she was also a strikingly beautiful athlete who was developing virtues such as perseverance and patience as a competitive swimmer and runner throughout her high school years. Like the diligent piano student practicing in preparation for a performance of the most beautiful of music written by the best of composers, Karnowski was developing a rich foundation of virtues, skills, excellences, you might say, dispositions, by which she would freely flourish in the face of a brutal illness that she hadn't yet discovered. Now, prior to getting to that point, she was very bright. She turned down an opportunity to go to West Point, and she went instead to Villanova University, where she started out in a pre-med track, but an unusual one. She was really gifted, so she was doing all the biology, the chemistry, physics, everything you need for med school. But she was also studying Islamic studies to expand her understanding of one of the major religions on the globe. And it was while she was there that she discovered she really was called to be a nurse. So at one point she would transfer schools to Pittsburgh, near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and actually engage in nursing studies. So on the 12th of August 1991, while on summer break between her junior and senior years of nursing school, Kronowski, at the age of 22, underwent surgical removal and biopsy of a grapefruit-sized tumor of unknown type at a hospital in Washington, D.C. Motivated to continue her nursing studies, she decided in prudent consultation with her physicians and family to return to school for her final year of undergraduate nursing studies. Like the advanced piano student who stays on course, even in the face of obstacles and difficulties, Kronowski did her best to continue her progression into the nursing profession. Late on Labor Day weekend, she was told that she was suffering with an adult-onset pediatric sarcoma. Some of you know what that means. It's scary stuff. A cancer for which there was certainly no known cure at the time. Rather than abruptly quitting school, she explored the possibility of undergoing cancer treatment at a medical facility in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, near the university at which she was enrolled. By late September, after further consultation with physicians in both Washington and Pittsburgh, she realized that her best option was to take academic leave and return to Washington, D.C. in order to participate in some research experimental protocols at the NIH. Like a piano student forced to step away from the instrument by unforeseen circumstances, not knowing whether a return to practice would ever materialize, she stepped away from a field of study and a university she really loved. The experimental protocols were not without danger. For example, one of the studies was designed to determine toxic levels of certain chemotherapeutic regimens for pediatric patients. Right? She's an adult with an adult-onset pediatric sarcoma, much larger, right? So she becomes a really good person to participate because they can hit her with high doses, right? That would, you guys get it, right? So while she hoped to be cured of her cancer, she knew that such an outcome was highly improbable. Having consulted with several physicians and her family, she chose to participate in the research protocols with the express motive of helping the researchers find beneficial answers for future pediatric patients while still hoping that she might somehow beat the cancer. Rather than choosing suicide as a convenient way in some respects to escape things akin, perhaps, to what, I don't know what was in Joel Roman's mind, but what she called the ravages of cancer, Kronowski faced her diagnosis with a love. Now, I'm not saying Roman wasn't a loving woman, but there was a kind of an expression of love, right? The dynamism of being loved by others and an ultimate other, her Lord, and loving them concomitantly. Thinking of the children who might benefit. Thinking that, who knows, maybe a miracle could take place, but also being a thoroughgoing realist. She knew what she was up against. The ravages of her cancer were substantial. They were frightening. She was frightened. And yet, even in the face of a rapid and profound physical demise, she stayed in touch with close college friends and remained active in her church's religious education, music, social, and pro-life ministries. That tells you something. She is a pro-lifer. That was her default setting with these issues. In a postcard to a close friend, her love of God and neighbor were quite clear. This is a friend with whom she went to nursing school. She writes, this was postmarked on the 23rd of November 1992 from Lourdes, France. She writes, "Hey dude!" exclamation point. "Had a wonderful pilgrimage to Fatima and Lourdes. God is good. We met beautiful people along the way and we were able to stay in convents in both places. I'm definitely ready now for whatever is coming next in my treatment. I'll talk to you soon, I'm sure. Love, Christy." By the time she had written this postcard that November, the cancer had spread throughout her entire body. She would be dead within 6 months. As her disease progressed, she intermittently descended into the clutches of gut-wrenching pain. She suffered ever more profound disfigurement and corresponding debilitation. by way of one example, she's a very religious young lady at this time. Secondary tumors were kind of starting to grow or progress out of her sternum. These became so sensitive that although she was on powerful pain medications, and they would get that straightened out, she, at least for a while, could no longer wear any religious medals or scapulars, because even the lightest touch to those outgrowths at that time was excruciating. This was spiritually painful for her because of the rich religious meaning of those medals to her. The cancer was rampant, and she was dying. In addition to the experimental protocols, she began undergoing radiation therapy. One day after radiation therapy, when her mother asked her how she was feeling, she responded, "Mom, I feel 200 years old today." Not one to complain, her statement disclosed just how poorly things were going on the physiological plane. That her pursuit of living in accord with her understanding of God's will was evidently flourishing. She continued to pray regularly, not only for herself, but for many other people. She also saw her own suffering, and even the suffering of her family members, in the light of Jesus' suffering on the cross and other scriptural reference points. And this is that part, you think about someone acquiring a language, not just learning it, but actually acquiring it, getting it in them, right? Or music, right? Reference points are a part of the mix, right? There's real content there. So in May 1993, for example, when she was close to death, her father said to her, "I am really not enjoying this Job experience at all." Now she's referring here to the biblical Old Testament character of Job, who is seen by many as sort of like at least one of the, if not the, within Scripture, sort of quintessential explication of deep, sort of existential suffering lived out. Her dad said that. And here's, without hesitation, she challenges him, albeit lovingly. When I was interviewing him, I was blown away by this. She said, "You should be proud!" Exclamation point. "Dad, don't you realize how much God loves you to trust you with this experience?" I don't know about you, but that is a very exceptional statement. I've not known many people in my nursing practice, and I practiced oncology nursing for a few years before I was a priest. I've known some patients who had that kind of an insight, but they're few and far between. She clearly saw both her own personal suffering and that of her family members as part of God's plan, which she was apparently embracing. A substantive part of the that for which and the that out of which of her decisions. What are my decisions flowing from? And why? Why? We can think of Christianity, I'm going to take just a quick segue here, but we can also think of non-Christians, such as Viktor Frankl, who's an existentialist philosopher and a psychiatrist, who in some respects was critical of Freud's concept of the human person on grounds that Frankl thought that actually humans are freer than he thought Freud was showing them to be. And Frankl held that you can choose to find the meaning in any given situation. And he wrote about this. Man's Search for Meaning is probably Frankl's greatest known work. But he has a whole corpus of writings looking at this. And Frankl was not a Christian. He was a Jew. And he almost died in Birkenau. And he wrote how even in Birkenau, his freedom was not destroyed. So, this is a very great mystery, this thing, human freedom, and what we can do with it. So during Kronowski's final days, many people came to pray over her and were pleasantly surprised when she would return the gift by praying over them. For example, two very close friends of hers, one a registered nurse and the other a social worker, visited her during the tail end of the twilight of her short life. Although she was very close to death, bladder and bowel control long gone, no use of her legs, and only partial mobility of her non-dominant arm, She seemed to these two to be radiant with a deep peace and joy, and others would say the same thing. After brief conversation, her two friends asked if she would like them to pray with her. She looked at them and smiled and said yes, so long as she could then pray over them. As the two finished praying, she raised her tremulous, non-dominant hand, the only hand she still had use of, and began to pray. Weighing less than 100 pounds, she prayed with an energy and a joy that seemed unbelievable to the nurse and the social worker. To use a little gallows phrasing of this, she was definitely melting into her bed. She was in her final demise, and yet it was as though she was at the same time concomitantly on a kind of ascent. There was definite debilitation. She was definitely dying, and yet there was this joy and this kind of deeper peace that was being manifest as she prayed over them. How could anyone so physically weak pray with such joy and strength? She was in terrible shape, actively dying, and yet she was beaming with apparent joy and light, an energy piercing the darkness of death's final approach. A profound paradox. Christy died several hours after this encounter at 24 years old. And so a brief closing look at both Joe Roman and Christy Kronowski. And if this sounds harsh at all, please forgive me. Chalk it up to my limited capabilities as an orator. I respect both of these women greatly. Yes, I'm not an advocate of assisted suicide. That said, please don't read into this any harsh judgment on my part of the state of Joe Roman's soul. I'm simply looking at these now with the two freedoms in mind. The earthly lives of Joe Roman and Christy Kronowski ended in ways rooted in two very different grasps of freedom and possibility. In accord with mere autonomy, freedom from paternalistic constraint, Roman freely chose to enter life on her own terms. Now, there was more to the picture in terms of her understanding of the artistry of her life, life's final brushstroke, but this was an autonomous act. Bearing in mind many people in Oregon and Washington who have chosen suicide out of real fear of losing their autonomy or things correlative to that, one might consider Roman's choice to be understandable and thus supportable. I see it to be understandable, but I don't see it to be supportable. If one were to pursue the question of freedom no further, one would consider Kronowski's pursuit to be exceptional, at best heroic or even saintly, at worst frightening, given her profound demise in her faith in and trust of some divine thou. Maybe I don't share her belief. Maybe I think she was coerced by that in some way. I can think many different things, but what I know of her case, it would indicate that that was the very thing that empowered her to walk in a very different way. If, on the other hand, one were to embrace Ping Cares' understanding of freedom for excellence or freedom to flourish, an enriched freedom for rather than the mere freedom from, and of course, like I've mentioned, this is deeply theological. One could see the courses of action of these two women, these two remarkable women really, quite differently. Christy Kronowski flourished as seen in her capacity to lovingly enter into a profound prayer exchange with two good friends, a beautiful embrace, even as death was making its final approach. In this line of thought, one might feel sad for Joe Roman, who settled for much less, in my estimation, when she chose to enter life with the support of family and friends. I see it as an ironic, self-inflicted, irreversible end, because once that decision was taken, there were no more choices to be made. Whereas in Kronowski's case, she hung in there till her natural end, and she continued making really amazing decisions throughout. Now, that doesn't always happen in end-of-life cases, this we know. So, Christy Kronowski's response to her illness shows us what can happen when we freely open up to a divine other and many others and real I-thou relationships. And so, just 4 closing points. Assisted suicide and euthanasia both cause death in order to escape suffering. They're essentially the same. The difference is who's committing the act. Who's committing the act? One, it's the person killing themselves. The other, it's someone else. Human flourishing consists in openness. Human freedom for excellence, right? Human freedom to flourish consists in openness to what I am ultimately free for. Freedom properly understood amounts to an openness to a divine other and to I-thou relationships. And is respect for autonomy sufficient for fully informed consent? Should more be brought to the table? So, thank you for listening. And at this point, we've got about 15 or so minutes. I'd like to just open the room for questions, so on and so forth, and I'll do my best to respond.